Do you know what it feels like to look at the man you married, the man you built a life with, the man you trusted with your children, and realize that everything, every single thing, was a performance? I want you to sit with that question for a second. Not rush past it. Actually sit with it. Because I didn't get to sit with it. When the truth hit me, it hit me all at once, in a hospital hallway, at 2 in the morning, while my daughter was in a recovery room and the surgeon was looking at me with eyes that told me something was very wrong before his mouth even opened. I didn't get the luxury of processing slowly. I had to absorb the most devastating thing a mother can hear while standing upright, while not screaming, while holding myself together because my child needed me to. And I did. I held myself together. And then I became the most dangerous version of myself I have ever been. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so glad you're here today. Wherever you're watching from, however your day is going, whatever the weather is outside your window right now, I want you to know that you landed in the right place. This channel is where we tell the stories that most people are too afraid to say out loud. The stories about what happens when love becomes a cage, when trust becomes a weapon, and when ordinary women decide they are done being ordinary victims. This story is mine. And I promise you, by the time we get to the end, you will understand why I am smiling right now. Why I am calm. Why the woman telling this story looks nothing like the woman this story starts with. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Not at the end. Now. Because this story is going to move fast, and I don't want you to miss a single second of it. And if you've been here before, you already know what we do. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what the weather's like. Tell me if you've ever looked at someone you loved and felt the ground disappear beneath you. My name is Nadine. Nadine Osebansu. And this is the story of how I went from a woman who couldn't recognize the monster sleeping next to her to the woman who burned everything he built to the ground and then built something beautiful on top of the ashes. But I have to start from the beginning. Because if I just told you the ending, you would not believe me. You would think I was exaggerating. You would think no man could be that calculated, that cold, that willing to use his own child as a financial transaction. I need you to understand who I was before, so you understand what it cost me to become who I am now. I was 24 when I married Kofi Mensadarko. 24 years old and absolutely certain that I had found the man God had specifically designed for me. I know how that sounds. I know. But you have to understand the context. I grew up in a household where my father adored my mother, where love was not complicated, where marriage was something you entered carefully and stayed in faithfully and tended like a garden. I grew up believing that if you chose the right person and you loved them correctly and you were patient and kind and present, that love would hold. That belief was my greatest vulnerability. And Kofi found it immediately. He was 31 when we met. A financial consultant at a firm in Accra with clients in London and Dubai and Toronto. He was polished in a way that felt earned, not performed. He spoke 4 languages. He called his mother every Sunday. He remembered the name of my childhood dog the second time we talked, which felt significant at the time, felt like evidence that he was listening, that he was genuinely interested in who I was. I was doing my residency in internal medicine. Exhausted most of the time. Working hours that left me with very little social life. When Kofi walked into the life I was barely managing to maintain, he felt like relief. He felt like someone arriving to help carry something I had been struggling to hold alone. We dated for 14 months. He proposed in the backyard of my parents' house with my mother crying and my father looking at him with this careful, measured approval that I mistook for endorsement. My father is a quiet man. He doesn't say much. But he watches everything. And I remember thinking, if my father approves, this is right. I should have asked my father later what he actually saw that day. Because I think the careful look wasn't approval. I think it was something closer to reservation. But I was 24 and in love, and I didn't ask the question. We got married on a Saturday in April. Beautiful day. 230 people. My dress had been made by a woman my aunt knew, and it was the most gorgeous thing I had ever worn. Kofi cried when he saw me walking toward him. Real tears, I thought. Now I wonder if he was just good at crying on demand. We moved into a house he had already purchased before the wedding, which at the time felt romantic. Decisive. Like he was building a life for us with intention. We had our first daughter, Amma, 14 months into the marriage. And then our second daughter, 2 years after that. For the first 3 years, I believed completely. I was tired, I was stretched, I was navigating motherhood and a demanding medical career and a marriage simultaneously, but I believed that Kofi and I were a team. He told me we were. He said it often. He said, "We're building something together, Nadine. You and me. Nobody can touch what we have." I held on to that. I should tell you about the first sign. Because there was one. There is always one, isn't there? And we always miss it. Was about 8 months old. I had just come off a night shift and I was running on 3 hours of sleep and I came home and Kofi was on the phone in our bedroom with the door closed, which was not itself strange. What was strange was that he opened the door the moment he heard my key in the lock, which meant he had been listening for me. And when he came out, his voice was different. Not dramatically. Just slightly higher than usual. A little too casual. He said, "Work stuff. Nothing interesting." And he kissed me on the forehead and went to get Ya from her crib. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Just a moment. And I thought that was strange. And then Ya started crying and I thought about sleep and I let the moment go. That moment was the beginning of everything. I just didn't know it yet. But I'm not at the end of the story yet. I'm at the beginning. And the beginning is about to get much harder. Let me tell you about the day my world actually ended. The day that made everything before it irrelevant and everything after it inevitable. Ya was 6 years old. She had been sick for months, what we thought was recurrent kidney infections. As a doctor, I monitored her myself. Perhaps too closely, because the emotional proximity made me second-guess my clinical instincts. I referred her to a pediatric nephrologist colleague of mine, Dr. Abina Tawia, who ran a full panel in October of that year. What Dr. Tawia found was not an infection. Ya had a single functioning kidney. Not because she was born that way. We had her scans from infancy. We had documentation. She was born with 2 healthy kidneys. She now had 1. When Dr. Tawia called me into her office and showed me the imaging and then gently, carefully asked me if I knew anything about a procedure Ya may have undergone, I remember my brain going completely silent. Not loud. Not screaming. Silent. Like someone had turned off all the sound in the world. I said, "What procedure?" And Dr. Tawia slid a file across her desk. A file she had received from a clinic in a city 3 hours away. A clinic that had records of a pediatric nephrectomy performed on a patient matching Ya's name, date of birth, and medical history. 17 months earlier. 17 months. My daughter had had a kidney removed 17 months ago, and I did not know. I was in the hospital the night it happened. I worked the night shift. Kofi had the girls. He told me I had a mild stomach bug and was staying home from school. He sent me a photo of her in bed watching cartoons with a bowl of soup on the tray beside her. She looked pale in the photo, which I registered, which I attributed to the stomach bug. She was pale because she had just come home from surgery. I sat in Dr. Tawia's office for a very long time. I don't know how long. She brought me water. She put her hand on my hand. And she said, "Nadine, you are a doctor. You know what I have to do with this information." I said, "I know." She said, "I have to ask you directly. Did you consent to this procedure?" And I said, "No." And the world as I had known it was over. I need you to understand something before we go any further. I need you to understand that the woman sitting in that office was not the woman who would eventually sit across from a prosecuting attorney and hand over a folder of evidence so complete, so methodical, so devastating that the attorney actually stopped in the middle of reading it and looked up at me and said, "Dr. Osei-Bonsu, are you sure you want to go this far?" And I said, "I already went this far the day he made the first phone call. But I am getting ahead of myself. And you deserve the whole story. You deserve every single piece of it, because this is not just about what Kofi did to Ya. This is about what he was planning. About how long he had been planning it. About how many other people were involved. And about how a woman who spent years being quiet and accommodating and grateful discovered that she had been gathering evidence, skills, and allies for years without even knowing that was what she was doing. Because God has a way of preparing you for battles before you even know you're in a war. Before I tell you what happened after I left Dr. Tawia's office, I need to go back further. I need to show you who Kofi was behind the face he wore at our dinner table. Because you cannot understand the horror of what he did to Ya without understanding the years of smaller corruptions that came before it. The lies that seemed small. The decisions that seemed unilateral, but that I accepted because I trusted him. The money that moved through our accounts in ways that I noticed, but didn't investigate because I was tired and busy, and I believed that my husband would not steal from me. He was stealing from me the entire time. Just not in the ways I could initially see. Come with me. I want to show you everything. If this story already has you, if you're already feeling something in your chest that won't let you scroll away, please do me one favor, leave a comment right now. Just say, I'm here. That's all. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is where you are. And if you are a mother watching this, if you have children whose faces came to your mind when I mentioned Ya, please share this story. Because what happened to my daughter happens more than people want to admit, and the only way it stops is if we refuse to be silent about it. Kofi Mensadarko was, by every visible measure, a good husband for the first 2 years of our marriage. I want to be honest about that because I think when people tell stories about bad men, they sometimes strip out the parts where those men were genuinely pleasant to be around. It doesn't serve the truth. The truth is that Kofi was charming and warm, and he made me feel seen, and that is precisely what made him so effective at what he was doing underneath the surface. He came from a family with what I would describe as complicated financial history. His father had been a businessman who made money in ways that were never clearly explained and lost most of it before Kofi was 20. His mother, a deeply religious woman named Afia, had held the family together through those losses with a combination of stubbornness and faith that I actually admired. Kofi spoke about his childhood with a kind of pride that came from having survived something. He said they were poor in a way that made him determined to never be poor again. I understood that. My family had not been wealthy. I understood the motivation to build security. What I didn't understand until much later was that Kofi's relationship with money was not about security. It was about accumulation. And more than accumulation, it was about control. He needed to feel like the person holding all the cards. And that need was so deep and so fundamental to who he was that he had structured our entire marriage around it without me fully realizing what was happening. I was the higher earner from early in our marriage. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. I was a doctor in a good position with a salary that reflected my training and my hours. Kofi's consulting income was variable, sometimes very good and sometimes modest. Very early in our marriage, he suggested we pool our income into a joint account that he would manage because, he said, I was so busy with work and residency and later with the girls, and he was better with numbers. And here is the moment I regret most, the one I replay the most, the one I would go back and change if I could. I said yes. Not because I was naive about money. I was not. I understood finances perfectly well. But I said yes because I was trying to make him feel needed. Because I had read enough about relationships to know that men who feel emasculated by their wives' earnings sometimes become resentful, and I did not want Kofi to feel that way. So I handed him the keys to our financial life as an act of generosity. He used those keys to build a second life on the side. The financial consulting firm he worked for was real. His clients were real. But he had, in parallel, begun investing in something else. A network of medical tourism brokers who connected buyers of human tissue with providers. Kidney brokers. I can barely write those words even now. He was, for at least 3 years before I found out, quietly involved in the organ trafficking industry under the cover of legitimate international medical consultation. I did not know this. I will say that clearly. I did not know. But there were signs. And I need to walk you through them because I think about them constantly. I think about the moments when the truth was right there and I looked at something else. The first sign was the phone call I already told you about, the one when Ya was 8 months old. The second sign came about 6 months later. Kofi came home from what he said was a conference in Kumasi, and he was different in a way I couldn't articulate. Not happier. Not sadder. Just different. Like someone who had made a decision they couldn't unmake. He was very affectionate that night. Almost uncomfortably so. The kind of affection that, I understand now, was guilt presenting as tenderness. The third sign was financial. About 4 months after that conference, a large sum moved out of our joint account. 70,000 Sadies. When I asked about it, Kofi said it was an investment opportunity, a property deal he was going in on with a colleague, and that it would return tripled within 18 months. I asked to see the paperwork. He showed me a document that looked legitimate. I reviewed it briefly. I did not review it carefully enough. The fourth sign was something I didn't register as a sign at all until later. Kofi started asking questions about the girl's medical history. Detailed questions that at the time I interpreted as a father becoming more engaged with his children's health. He asked about their blood types, about their organ health from their pediatric checkups, about whether their kidneys were functioning normally. I thought he was being a concerned parent. I answered every question thoroughly. I was giving him the information he needed to evaluate which of our daughters was a more viable candidate. I cannot sit with that thought for too long without losing my composure. So I am going to keep moving. By the time Alma was 5 and Ya was 3, Kofi had built a quiet but functional relationship with a man named Bright Asante, who I would later learn was a mid-level coordinator in an organ trafficking network that operated primarily out of a private clinic in the Brangahafo region. Bright had connections to buyers in the Gulf, mostly wealthy individuals with end-stage renal disease who were willing to pay enormous sums for kidneys that didn't require them to wait years on an official transplant list. Kofi's role was not surgical. He was not a doctor. His role was coordination and finance. He connected donors, or in this case, victims, with the clinic. He arranged payment structures. He helped ensure that paperwork was created or destroyed as needed. He was the business mind behind something that had no business being in business. And his daughter was his most accessible resource. I want you to understand that Ya was not the only child involved. She was not. But she is my child, and she is the reason I am telling this story, and so she is the center of this account. What happened to other children through this network is something that the investigators ultimately uncovered, and that I will tell you about when we get to that part of the story. In the meantime, I was going to work. I was treating patients. I was coming home to a man who cooked dinner twice a week and attended school events, and told me he loved me with a consistency that I read as reliability. He was reliable, just not in the way I understood. The months leading up to Ya's surgery were ones I now see as the period of preparation. Kofi was more attentive than usual. He was managing the girls more, taking them to appointments himself, insisting that I rest when I came home from long shifts. I thought he was being a good husband. I thought we were in a good season. He was making sure he had unmonitored access to Ya. The night of the surgery, I was not home. I have established that. What I also need to tell you is that Ya does not remember most of it. She remembers being in the car with her father. She remembers him telling her they were going somewhere special. She was 5 years old. She remembers waking up with her stomach hurting and her father being there, and him telling her not to worry, that she'd had a little procedure and she was fine, and she shouldn't tell Mommy because Mommy would get scared about nothing. My daughter kept that secret for 17 months because her father told her not to worry her mother. 5 years old. Keeping a secret about her own surgery. When I think about those 17 months, about Ya walking around with one kidney, with a scar she kept covered, with a secret she was too young to understand, but old enough to feel the weight of, something happens in my chest that I don't have a word for. It is beyond anger. It is beyond grief. It is some combination of both that my body doesn't know what to do with. Dr. Tawia's report put the surgery at 17 months prior. It also noted that Ya's remaining kidney was healthy and functioning well. That was the one mercy in the whole situation. My daughter was physically stable. She was not in danger, at least not immediately. But I was her mother and I was a doctor, and I knew that a child with a single kidney had a lifetime of careful management ahead of her. Dietary restrictions. Rigorous monitoring. Avoidance of contact sports. Annual imaging. She would carry this forever. Not just the physical reality of it, but the memory. The knowledge that her father had done this to her. That knowledge would come later for her, when she was old enough to understand. For me, it came all at once in Dr. Tawia's office on a Tuesday afternoon in November. And it made me into a completely different person. I drove home from the hospital that evening in a state of absolute control. That is what I want you to understand. I did not cry in the car. I did not scream. I have spent years in emergency medicine. I have been in rooms where people are dying and families are falling apart, and the one thing that is always required of me is that I do not fall apart too. I have trained my nervous system to stay functional under extreme pressure, and I used that training that night. I needed to think before I acted. Because I knew, with absolute clinical certainty, that if I walked into my house and confronted Kofi without a plan, he would deny it. He would have an explanation. He was a man who always had an explanation. And if he realized I knew, he would start dismantling evidence. He might run. He might do something worse. I needed him to not know that I knew. For as long as possible. So I drove home, and I cooked dinner, and I watched him help you with her homework at the kitchen table, and I sat across from him and ate, and I asked about his day, and I listened to his answer, and I did not let a single thing show on my face. If you are wondering how I did that, I will tell you, I thought about Ya. Every time I felt the scream rising, I thought about Ya sitting across from me, healthy, alive, her one kidney doing the work of two, and I reminded myself that the best thing I could do for her in that moment was stay very, very calm. After the girls were in bed, Kofi and I sat in the living room, and he asked me how my day was. And I said, busy. One of my cases took an unexpected turn. And he said, do you want to talk about it? And I said, not yet. I'm still working through it. I went to bed that night, and I stared at the ceiling for 6 hours. I did not sleep. I planned. The first thing I did the next morning was call my friend and colleague, Dr. Kwesi Ampansa, who worked in forensic pathology and who I trusted completely. I didn't tell him everything on the phone. I asked him to meet me for lunch off hospital grounds, at a place where we would not run into anyone from our professional circle. Over that lunch, I told him what Dr. Tawia had found. I watched his face change. And then I told him what I needed from him. Not medically, but in terms of advice. Kwesi had a cousin who was an attorney who specialized in criminal law. He called his cousin while we were still at the table. That was the beginning of what I now call the infrastructure. The quiet, careful, methodical building of a case that would eventually become inescapable for Kofi Mensadarko. But before I could build anything, I had to face a catastrophe that I had not anticipated. One that changed the timeline of everything. 3 days after my lunch with Kwesi, Kofi told me he needed to take Alma to a specialist. He said she had been having some lower back pain, possibly a muscle issue, and he had scheduled an appointment at a clinic he had found through a colleague. Alma was 9. When he said this, something cold moved through my entire body. Not because there was anything outwardly alarming about the sentence. A child with back pain. A father scheduling an appointment. Normal. Completely normal. Except that I knew what I now knew. And I had been a doctor long enough to understand that lower back pain in a child, framed in a certain way, could be the beginning of a narrative. A narrative built to justify a procedure. I looked at him. I smiled. I said, that's so thoughtful of you. Which clinic? He told me the name. It was not a clinic I recognized. I said nothing. I said, what time is the appointment? I might be able to come. And I watched something flicker across his face. Very briefly. A recalibration. He said, oh, you don't have to do that. I know you're busy. I can handle it. I said, I want to. She's my daughter. Let me know the time. He said he would. He didn't. The next day he told me the clinic had called and rescheduled. He seemed relaxed when he said it. Like it was nothing. But I had already, the night before, looked up the clinic. And what I found was that it had a reported affiliation with a larger medical group that had been flagged in an investigative piece published 2 years prior by a Ghanaian investigative journalism outlet. The piece was about irregularities in private surgical procedures performed on minors. The journalist who wrote it, a woman named Efua Darko, who happened to share Kofi's family name though they were not related, had not been able to get enough evidence to name specific individuals. The piece was thorough but inconclusive. I found Efua Darko's contact information, and I sent her an email that night. I said I had information relevant to her article. I said I wanted to talk. She responded within 2 hours. And in the meantime, I called my mother. I want to talk about my mother for a moment because she is crucial to what comes next, and because she deserves more than a passing mention. My mother's name is Patricia, and she is the most pragmatically fierce person I have ever known. She does not panic. She does not indulge in lengthy emotional processing when there is work to be done. When I called her and told her, quietly and simply, what I had discovered about there was a silence on the line that lasted about 4 seconds. And then she said, "Where are the girls right now?" I said, "Amma is at school. Is with the house help." She said, "I am going to come and stay with you." I said, "I don't want to alarm Kofi." She said, "I will not alarm him. I am coming for a visit because I miss my grandchildren." That is all anyone needs to know. My mother arrived the next day with 2 suitcases and a calm that I am still in awe of. Kofi was genuinely pleased to see her because my mother had always been warm with him. Warmer, I now think, than her instincts actually allowed, but she had made a choice to give him the benefit of the doubt for my sake, and she had honored that choice for years. She was done honoring it now. But he would not know that for a while. Having my mother in the house changed the dynamic in a way that was essential. Kofi's access to the girls was now naturally, casually constrained. My mother was always there, volunteering to take the girls places, insisting on being present. And Kofi couldn't object without it seeming odd. The rescheduled appointment for Amma never happened. Whether because Kofi sensed the shift or because the logistics became harder with my mother present, I don't know. But it didn't happen, and Amma's back pain resolved itself as mysteriously as it had appeared. I had protected her. For now. But I knew I was in a race. I knew that Kofi would eventually sense something had changed, and when he did, he would move. I needed to move faster. The attorney Kwesi's cousin connected me with was named Osei Poku. He was a criminal defense attorney by training who had crossed into prosecution assistance work over the last decade, which meant he knew exactly how cases like this were built and exactly where they fell apart. He was a small, precise man who communicated almost entirely in bullet points and who had exactly 0 patience for anything irrelevant. The first time we met, he looked at the initial documentation I brought him, the records from Dr. Tawia, the clinic records, the flagged journalism piece, and he said, "This is suggestive. It is not yet prosecutable. You need the money trail." I said, "How do I get the money trail?" He said, "Has he ever given you access to all of the accounts?" I said, "He manages most of them." He looked at me without judgment and said, "Do you have the account numbers?" I had some. I didn't have all of them. He said, "We need all of them." So began the second phase of what was probably the most stressful period of my life, which is saying something considering I had been through a pediatric surgical training program and 2 complicated deliveries. I had to, without alerting Kofi, find the financial accounts he had not told me about. This was harder than it sounds. Kofi was meticulous. He kept physical paperwork in a locked cabinet in his home office that I had never had reason to access before. He was not careless with his phone. He did not leave his laptop open. But he was also a man who believed completely in my obliviousness. He had spent years calibrating my perception of our finances in a particular direction, and he trusted that calibration. Which meant that when I sat down at the dining table one Saturday morning while he was at the gym and my mother had taken the girls to the market, and I took a paper clip and opened that locked cabinet, he did not see it coming. Because it never occurred to him that I would do it. I am not going to tell you that I wasn't afraid. My hands were shaking. I had a small camera, the kind journalists use for document photography, that Efua Darko had lent me. I was methodical. I photographed every document in that cabinet and replaced everything exactly as I found it and closed the drawer and sat down and breathed. I had the money trail. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to show Osei Poku, who looked at the photographs and said good in a tone that was the professional equivalent of someone else saying extremely good. There were accounts I hadn't known about. 3 of them. 1 local, 2 international, 1 in a jurisdiction that Osei Poku identified immediately as a common haven for illicit funds flows. The amounts in these accounts were not small. Together, they represented significantly more money than Kofi's legitimate consulting income over the same period could account for. The money had to have come from somewhere. And I already knew, with a mother's certainty and a doctor's clarity, where it had come from. During this period, I also had my first real conversation with Efua Darko. We met at her office, which was not glamorous, but was organized in the way that spaces belonging to people who are very serious about their work always are. She had files on the clinic I had identified as affiliated with Alma's supposed appointment. She had files on the medical tourism network. She had a source she had been protecting for 2 years who had been giving her information in pieces, never enough to publish, always enough to keep her looking. When I sat down across from her and told her what had happened to Ya, she stopped writing. She looked up. And she said, "The source has been telling me there was at least one child from a professional family in Accra. I never had a name. I never had documentation." I said, "You have both now." She said, "If I publish this, it will be significant. But it will also put you in the middle of a very large story. Are you prepared for that?" I said, "I've been in the middle of it since the moment my daughter was born. I just didn't know it." We agreed on a timeline. She would not publish until I told her I was ready. Because I needed certain things to happen in a certain order. Publication before the legal process was ready would allow people to scatter. The network was not just Kofi. It was not just Bright Asante. It was multiple layers of people, coordinating, facilitating, profiting. I needed all of them. Not just Kofi. But I also need to tell you what was happening to me personally during this time. Because this account would be dishonest if I made it sound like I was purely strategic and functional throughout. I was not. There were nights when the girls were asleep and my mother was asleep and Kofi was in his office, and I sat in the bathroom with the fan on so no one could hear me, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was very young. Not because I didn't know what to do. I knew what to do. But because Ya was 6 years old and she had 1 kidney, and the reason she had 1 kidney was her father. And there is a grief. He looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. And then he said, "Of course not. I just don't want it to become an issue if investigators start looking at anyone associated with the clinic." I said, "Well, if you haven't done anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about." He said, "Of course." He closed his laptop. He went upstairs. I stood in the kitchen, and I felt the whole thing accelerating toward its conclusion in a way that was both terrifying and, somehow, a relief. Because I had been holding this alone for months, with only my mother and Kwesi and Ose Poku and Efua Darko knowing what was actually happening. The performance of normalcy had been the most exhausting thing I had ever sustained. I texted Ose Poku, "He knows something. I need 48 hours. He responded, "You have 24. Call me tomorrow morning." I went upstairs. I checked on the girls. Ya was sleeping with her hand under her cheek the way she had since she was a baby. I stood in her doorway for a long time. Then I went to bed. And for the first time in months, I slept. I think my body knew that the waiting was almost over. The next morning, I called Ose Poku and we established the final timeline. Efua Darko would publish her article in 4 days. The regulatory body investigation would conclude in conjunction with a police referral. Ose Poku had been in contact with the Economic and Organized Crime Office, ECO, who had been building their own case and had agreed to coordinate with the civil action I was pursuing. And there was one more thing. One piece that Ose Poku told me about that I had not known until that morning. The financial forensics expert had found a record of payment from Kofi's international account to the clinic. A payment made the week after Ya's surgery. The amount, $60,000. $60,000. My daughter's kidney. I wrote that number down on a piece of paper, and I folded the paper, and I put it in my pocket, and I carried it with me for the next 4 days as a reminder of what I was doing and why I could not stop. I want to be honest about what the legal process costs. Because I think people hear stories like mine, and they imagine that once you have the evidence and the attorney and the plan, it becomes clean. It does not. It gets messier before it gets clearer, and there is a period in the middle where you lose things you didn't expect to lose, and you feel the ground under your feet in a way that is new and frightening. Kofi left the house on a Sunday morning. He told me he needed to go in person to deal with the clinic situation. He took a bag. He kissed both girls on their heads. He told me he would be back by Wednesday. I watched him walk to his car. And as he was putting his bag in the trunk, I noticed that the bag was larger than a 3-day bag. It was packed in the way someone packs when they are not sure they're coming back. I called Poku before Kofi's car was out of the neighborhood. Poku had already anticipated this. He had been in contact with ECO, and there was already a flag on Kofi's passport. He would not be leaving the country. But he could certainly create complications if he went aground domestically. What followed was 3 days that I cannot fully describe in their granularity, but the essential shape of them was this. Kofi did not go to deal with the clinic. He went to try to reach Bright Asante, who had already, it turned out, been arrested 2 days prior by ECO on a separate tip. The network was collapsing from multiple directions simultaneously because Poku was not the only one who had been building a case. There were investigators who had been working this for months independently, and the cases were converging. Kofi was arrested on a Tuesday morning at a guest house in a city 4 hours from Accra. I was not there. I was at the hospital seeing patients. My phone rang and it was Poku, and he said, simply, "They have him." I stepped outside the ward. I stood in a corridor. And the thing I felt was not triumph. Not yet. It was something more complicated. Something that had relief in it and grief in it, and an exhaustion so profound that my legs actually buckled, and I put my hand on the wall to stay upright. A nurse I didn't know very well saw me from down the hall and came to ask if I was okay. I said, "I will be." And I meant it differently than I would have meant it a year ago. The weeks that followed Kofi's arrest were the ones I would describe as the darkest, even though the outcome I had worked toward had technically been achieved. Because arrest is not conviction. And a man who had spent years managing perceptions and creating paper trails and cultivating professional relationships had resources that I did not, including access to very skilled legal representation. His attorney was a man named Anchibosiako, who I will say, grudgingly, was extremely good at his job. He immediately moved to characterize Kofi's involvement in the network as peripheral, as consulting rather than coordinating, as financial rather than operational. He challenged the admissibility of the clinic records. He argued that the payment from Kofi's account could be explained by legitimate consulting fees. Every move they made, Poku had anticipated and countered. But it was not fast. And it was not clean. And there were weeks when I sat in meetings with attorneys and investigators and felt the weight of what proving this would actually require. And then there was the matter of telling Ya. Not everything. She was 6. But enough. Enough for the medical professionals who would now be part of her care to speak honestly with her about her body. Enough so that she was not carrying a secret anymore. That conversation happened with a child psychologist named Dr. Adwoa Nyarko present, and it was the hardest conversation of my life. Ya listened. She looked at her hands. And then she looked up at me and said, "Daddy said it was a small procedure." I said, "I know he did, love." She said, "Was it not?" I said, "It was bigger than he told you." She thought about this. And then she said, "Is that why you and Daddy don't live together anymore?" I said, "Yes." She nodded slowly. Like she had been waiting for confirmation of something she already knew. And then she leaned against me, and I held her, and I thought that whatever it cost me to get through the legal process, I would pay it. Without question. Without hesitation. There came a moment, somewhere in the 5th month after Kofi's arrest, when Poku sat across from me and said, in the careful, precise way he said everything, "You have an option. His attorneys are proposing a plea arrangement. He would plead to a lesser charge, receive a shorter sentence, and in exchange, cooperate fully with the investigation into the broader network." I sat with this for a moment. He said, "The advantage is that the people above him in the network become more accessible. The cooperation requirement is significant. The disadvantage is that he receives substantially less punishment than the full charges would carry." I said, "What is your recommendation?" He said, "My recommendation is that you consider what outcome serves Ya's long-term interest most. A lengthy individual prosecution that exhausts resources and keeps this in the courts for years. or a coordinated takedown of the entire network that puts multiple people in prison, including the ones who bought this arrangement and the ones who supplied it, with Kofi serving meaningful time. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about the people above Kofi in the network. The buyers who had been willing to pay $60,000 for a child's kidney. The people who ran the clinic. The ones who had done this not once but many times, to children who did not have a mother who was also a doctor, who did not have access to Poku and Kwesi and Efua Darko. Children whose stories had never been told. I said, I want the whole network. Poku said, that is what I thought you would say. He negotiated the cooperation agreement in a way that ensured Kofi's cooperation was genuine and not performative. The plea involved a meaningful custodial sentence. It was not nothing. It was not what I might have wanted in my most raw moments. But it was real, and it was part of something larger. But the decision that mattered more to me personally, the one that I think of as the true turning point, was not the plea negotiation. It was what I decided to do with myself during the process. A colleague had reached out to me during this period, a woman named Dr. Surwa Apia, who ran a pediatric health advocacy NGO. She had read about the case, pieces of it had begun to emerge publicly through Efua Darko's reporting, and she contacted me to ask if I would be willing to contribute to a policy advocacy push around protections for children in private medical settings. I said yes, almost without thinking, because here was something I could actually build. Something that came from what had happened to Ya but was not defined by it. Something that used my skills, my professional standing, my very specific and hard-won understanding of how this type of crime operated, to make it harder for it to happen to someone else. I also, around this time, moved my girls and my mother into a house that was mine alone. Not the house Kofi had bought before our wedding, which had always been in his name and which became the subject of its own legal process. A house I found, a house I furnished slowly and carefully, a house that Amma and Ya walked through for the first time with the serious consideration of children who are picking out their rooms, which is the most grounding thing I have ever witnessed. Amma chose the room with the window that looked over the small garden. Ya chose the room closest to mine. She said it was because she liked the color of the walls. But she slept better once we were in that house, and so did I. There is a version of this story where I tell you that someone came into my life romantically during this period and restored my faith in love, and while I will not tell you that never happened, I will tell you that it is not the center of this story's recovery. The center is something simpler and more fundamental. The center is the realization, which came to me not in a dramatic moment but gradually, over weeks and months, that I was capable of more than I had understood. That the years of trusting Kofi, of managing the marriage, of maintaining the performance of normalcy while building a case in secret, had revealed a version of myself that I had not met before. I had not known, before all of this, how much I could hold. How much I could carry and still function. How much I could lose and still rebuild. I had not known that I was this person. Now I do. Efua Darko's article ran on a Thursday morning in the digital edition of her publication. By Friday, it had been picked up by 3 national newspapers and 2 international outlets that covered African affairs. By Saturday, it was everywhere. The article named Kofi. It named Bright Asante. It named the clinic. It described the network in terms that were accurate because they were sourced, documented, and corroborated. It included the account of a second family whose child had been a victim, a family from the western region whose son had lost a kidney 4 years prior, and who had spent those 4 years being told by doctors that he had simply been born with a single kidney. Efua had found them through the source who had been feeding her information for 2 years. 2 families. 2 children. 1 network. The article also, with my full consent and participation, included Ya's story. Not her name, not her photograph, but her story, told accurately and with the medical detail that made it irrefutable. Efua had verified everything with Dr. Tawia and with the ECO investigators who confirmed they were pursuing the case. The response was immediate and enormous. My phone did not stop. My email did not stop. People who had heard rumors about the clinic for years and had not known who to tell. Parents whose children had received care at affiliated facilities and who were now terrified and who deserved, at minimum, the reassurance of proper follow-up imaging. I spent that weekend coordinating with Dr. Apia's NGO to set up a helpline and a triage process for families who needed to follow up on their children's health. It was the most exhausting weekend of my life and also, somehow, the most purposeful. The trial began 8 months after Kofi's arrest. The plea agreement had been finalized and Kofi had begun cooperating, which meant that by the time his sentencing happened, the prosecution of the broader network was significantly advanced. The clinic director had been arrested. 2 additional coordinators had been identified and apprehended. 3 buyers, international, had been flagged to authorities in their respective countries through Interpol channels. Kofi's sentencing was not a trial in the traditional sense, given the plea. But there was a hearing. And I was there. I sat in the courtroom with Osei Poku on my left and my mother on my right, and I watched Kofi walk in, and I want to tell you honestly what I felt. He was thinner. He looked like a man who had spent 8 months with the full weight of what he had done pressing down on him, or possibly just the weight of the consequences, which may or may not be the same thing. He did not look at me when he came in. He looked at the floor. The judge was a woman named Justice Ama Botang, who had a reputation in legal circles for being uncompromising in cases involving harm to children. When she read the sentencing, her voice was entirely level. She addressed Kofi by his full name and she said, "Mr. Mensadarko, you did not commit a financial crime. You committed an act of profound violence against your own child and against the institution of parental trust. The court acknowledges your cooperation with the broader investigation and recognizes the terms of the plea agreement. The court does not, however, minimize the gravity of what you have done." He received a sentence that, with the cooperation credit, translated to 7 years. The clinic director received 12. Bright Asante received 9. I watched Kofi being led out of the courtroom. And just before the door closed behind him, he turned. And he looked at me. And I held his gaze. And then he was gone. I did not feel triumphant in that moment. I felt finished. There is a difference. Triumph is loud. What I felt was quiet. Like something that had been pressing on my chest for a very long time had finally lifted. Outside the courthouse, there were journalists. I gave a brief statement that Osei Poku and I had prepared. I said that my hope was that the outcome of this case would serve as part of a larger structural effort to protect children, and that the NGO partnership I had joined would be pursuing legislative advocacy in that direction. I said that my daughters were well, and that we were building a good life. I said that justice is not a destination but a practice, and that I intended to keep practicing it. Someone in the crowd called out and asked how I was. I looked in the direction of the voice and I said, "She is wonderful. She is exactly who she was always going to be." That was the truest thing I said that day. It is now 2 years and 4 months since Kofi's sentencing. I want to tell you what the world looks like from here. Ya is 8 years old. She is sharp and funny and completely obsessed with marine biology, which none of us saw coming, but which makes perfect sense for a child who has always been drawn to things that exist just below the surface. She has annual renal imaging which she approaches with the boredom of someone who has done it many times. Her remaining kidney is healthy. She is healthy. She knows, in the age-appropriate language of the conversations she has had with Dr. Nyarko over the past 2 years, that her father made a terrible choice, and that it was not her fault, and that her body is not broken. Just different than it would otherwise have been. She asked me once, about 6 months ago, if she would ever see her father again. I said that was a question we would answer when she was older and when she knew better what she wanted. She said, "Do you think I should want to?" And I said, "I think that whatever you feel is allowed. You don't have to decide right now." She nodded with the gravity of an 8-year-old who is used to carrying things. And then she went back to her book about octopuses. Amma is 11. She is in every academic club her school offers, and she has already told me she wants to be an attorney. When she said this, I looked at my daughter for a long moment and thought that there are things that get passed down through devastation that you could not have designed intentionally. That the child who watched her mother navigate the legal system with precision and determination might decide that precision and determination in the service of justice is a career she wants to pursue. I think that is one of the better outcomes I could have hoped for. My mother is still with us. She has her own room in our house. She says she will go back to her own place when the girls are older. I say there is no rush. We both know she is not leaving. Kwesi Mpanza and I are still close friends. He was best man at his own wedding last year, which I attended with my girls, and which was a genuinely joyful occasion. The kind of event that reminds you that good things happen, that people build beautiful things, that not every chapter is the one you are afraid of. Efua Darko's reporting on the organ trafficking network continued for nearly a year after the initial article. She won 2 journalism awards. She was nominated for a 3rd. She is working on a book. I have spoken to her for it at length because I believe the book matters. Because the families of the children who were harmed deserve more than a legal outcome. They deserve a complete account. Dr. Apia's NGO, in which I now serve as the Director of Medical Advocacy, successfully pushed for legislative amendments to private clinic oversight regulations that were passed by Parliament 10 months ago. The amendments require mandatory independent auditing of all surgical procedures performed on minors in private facilities, with parental consent verification protocols that are now considerably more robust than they were. This is not everything. It is not close to everything. But it is something. I speak at medical conferences now, occasionally, about the intersection of clinical medicine and advocacy. About what doctors are positioned to observe when they are paying attention. About the ways that clinical detachment and emotional investment are not opposites but tools, and that knowing when to use which one is a skill that saved my daughter and that I want to share with every physician who will listen. And then there's the house. Our house. With the garden that Alma loves and the room close to mine where Yas sleeps. I have painted it in the colors the girls chose. I have filled it with books and plants and the very specific chaos of 2 growing children. On Sunday mornings we cook together, all 4 of us, my mother and me and Alma and Ya, and the kitchen is loud and slightly disorganized and completely, thoroughly ours. I want to tell you something that I have thought about for a long time and that I believe is true. The years I spent with Kofi were not entirely lost. I know that might sound strange, but they gave me my daughters. They gave me the experience of loving completely and being betrayed completely, which showed me that I could survive both. They gave me the particular kind of clarity that only comes when you have lost everything you thought was holding you up and discovered that you were, all along, holding yourself up. I did not know that. I needed to know that. I know it now. To every person watching this who is in the middle of something they are not sure they can survive, I want to say this as plainly as I know how: you will survive it. Not because it stops hurting. It doesn't always stop hurting. But because you are more capable than the version of yourself that existed before the crisis. The crisis is revealing someone you haven't met yet. That person is extraordinary. And they're already in there, waiting for you to need them. I spent a lot of years being the person who was grateful to be loved. I am now the person who understands that I was always worth loving, and that the difference between those 2 versions of me is the whole story. My name is Nadine Osebansu. I was 24 when I married the wrong man. I was 31 when I found out what he had done to our daughter. I was 32 when I watched justice happen in a courtroom and felt the weight lift. And I am 33 now, standing in the life I actually built, the one that belongs completely to me and to my girls, and I am telling you that it is possible to get here. It is possible to get here. Before I let you go, I want to ask you something. This story, all of it, the building and the breaking and the rebuilding, lives in me as proof that ordinary people contain extraordinary capacity. And I want to know what you carry. What story is inside you that you have been afraid to tell out loud? Leave it in the comments. Not all of it if you're not ready, but some of it. A sentence. Something that says, I was there too, and I made it through. Because that is what this channel is. This is the place where we don't pretend. Where we show the full picture, the devastation and the recovery, the grief and the growth, with nothing left out. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt familiar or important or like something you needed to hear today, please share it. Not for me, though I appreciate it deeply, but because there is someone in your circle who is sitting in the middle of their own impossible situation and who needs to hear that other people have been in the middle and made it out. Like this video. Share it. Subscribe if you haven't. And come back, because there are more stories to tell. Stories of women who found themselves in impossible situations and discovered that they were, all along, completely capable of the impossible. I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And if you have children, hold them close tonight. Not in fear. In love. That is always the right response. Always in love.